The history taught in schools often feels like a building with a beautiful facade, hiding completely different, much more mysterious structures behind it. We're accustomed to trusting the official timeline, yet there is a little known but striking detail that could completely rewrite what we know about our past. This seemingly insignificant detail has been in plain sight for centuries, captured in marble and on canvas, but we have stubbornly refused to give it the importance it deserves. We are talking about the physical appearance of those who inhabited our planet before the early 20th century. Specifically, a unique anatomical feature that radically distinguishes the ancient elite from modern humans. If we cast aside the habit of merely skimming the surface and carefully examine the surviving heritage of antiquity, whether majestic statues or old paintings, we can notice a strange but consistent pattern. At first glance, these seem like ordinary people, the usual body structure, 2 arms, 2 legs. However, once you focus on the profile, a completely atypical facial structure immediately catches the eye. It is not even the size of the nose that draws attention, but specifically the area of the bridge, the place where the respiratory organ connects to the frontal bone. In the vast majority of modern people, there is a natural indentation here, a dip under the brow ridges. But in key figures of ancient history, this feature is completely absent. Looking at images from ancient Egypt or ancient Greece, we see a perfectly straight line. The forehead flows smoothly without the slightest curve, dip, or pit into a straight, massive nose. For decades, skeptics and art historians have dismissed this as the so-called Greek profile, an artistic canon, a stylization, or an attempt to idealize appearance. We are told that sculptors tried to convey divine beauty by sacrificing realism. However, this theory begins to fall apart when it comes to statues found during actual archaeological excavations in layers that rule out modern forgeries. Artifacts pulled from the ground, for instance in the Gaza Strip, or discovered during massive bridge construction projects, possessed these same uncompromising characteristics. This is not a symbolic mask, but a detailed, scrupulous reproduction of anatomy where the bone structure is rendered with frightening accuracy. The heads of ancient heroes like Alexander the Great, Olympian gods like Hermes, Artemis, Dionysus, or the famous Aphrodite invariably have this specific profile. The line of the forehead and nose forms a single vector, creating a look that would seem alien and perhaps even frightening to us today. It is important to note that sculptors did not bestow these features upon everyone. Common people, craftsmen, and slaves were depicted differently. Their faces were closer to the appearance we are used to, with ordinary nose bridges. This straight profile was the hallmark of a privileged class, an undeniable marker of a higher caste. One gets the distinct impression that ancient masters were not fantasizing, but documenting with precision the appearance of beings who actually lived, ruled, and were considered the standard of power. If this phenomenon were limited exclusively to the territory of ancient Greece or Rome, one could try to explain it as a local genetic mutation or the isolated fashion of a single people. But the facts are relentless and suggest otherwise, forcing us to expand our search horizons. The geography of the straight nose extends far beyond the Mediterranean, covering vast territories and breaking down the usual boundaries of historical eras. What we are used to considering a feature of ancient Europe turns out to be just a fragment of a global mosaic, traces of which lead us much further east and south, hinting at the existence of a single ruling stratum throughout the ancient world. The geography of this phenomenon expands at an alarming rate once you delve into museum reserves and archaeological expedition reports across the Eurasian continent. If we shift our focus from the familiar European capitals to the east, the picture does not change. Instead, it acquires an even more global and mysterious scale. In the territories of ancient Persia, in the lands of modern-day Iraq and Iran, researchers find sculptural portraits of rulers whose profiles are identical to the faces of Greek gods or Roman Caesars. We see the same continuous line connecting the forehead and the tip of the nose, the same high cheekbones and specific eye placement. This seems incredible, as local tribes possessed a completely different anthropological type, yet their stone idols and kings look like aliens from another world. Moving further east, we discover similar evidence in India and even in Afghanistan. One of the most striking examples is the famous find known as the Genius of the Flowers, discovered in the Afghan sands. The facial features of this character have nothing in common with the indigenous population of the region. It is the same monolithic profile, devoid of a dip, that we saw in Athens and Thebes. Fragments of ancient murals in cave temple complexes in Asia, for example in Jhansi, also capture people with this characteristic, almost architectural facial feature. We end up with a paradoxical situation. Across the vast expanses from the Nile to the Indus, covering Europe, Africa, and Asia, the ruling elite possessed a unified appearance. It is important to understand the social context of creating such works of art in antiquity. Statues, bas-reliefs, and ceremonial portraits were never made in honor of commoners, peasants, or merchants. Stone and marble were the privilege of power. This means that the depicted people belonged to the highest caste, the elite who held the fates of nations in their hands. Logic suggests that rulers in Central Asia or India should have come from local influential families and borne ethnic traits of their subjects. But art stubbornly testifies to the contrary. The rulers of different countries and continents looked more like each other than like their own peoples. It is as if they belonged to a single, separate biological species or a closed clan that extended its influence over the entire civilized world of that time. This transcontinental resemblance of rulers makes one wonder about the existence of a single genetic line that controlled the key civilizations of antiquity. These were people or beings whose main distinguishing mark was a massive, straight nose transitioning into the forehead without the slightest hint of a bridge. However, a skeptic might object. Perhaps we are dealing with a global fashion, an ancient canon of beauty that sculptors simply copied from region to region, ignoring the real appearance of their patrons. Was this not just an artistic device designed to glorify the leader by giving him the features of a deity? To destroy this doubt, we must leave the dusty halls of ancient museums and transport ourselves to an era when realism became the main criterion of art. If the straight profile were merely an invention of ancient masters, it should have disappeared with the arrival of new times, but this did not happen. Moreover, evidence of the existence of this mysterious race can be found not only on the canvases of the great Renaissance painters who strove for anatomical accuracy, but on items that might be in your pocket or wallet right now. If you look at the history of currency, the Renaissance, which proclaimed a return to ancient ideals, was actually not just a period of copying ancient forms, but a period of documenting reality. Great masters of the brush like Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael were not just artists, but also scrupulous researchers of anatomy. Leonardo, known for his obsession with the structure of the human body and who performed dissections to understand the truth, hardly would have distorted the facial features of his models for the sake of a fictional canon. Peering into the portraits of that era, such as the famous Lady with an Ermine or Raphael's Madonnas, we discovered the same characteristic profile, a high forehead line flowing smoothly into the nose without the slightest depression. Italian painters of the 16th century captured the elite of their time with photographic precision, and these faces surprisingly repeat the features of statues created thousands of years before them. This confirms that the carriers of the divine profile did not vanish with the fall of Rome, but continued to occupy dominant positions in the European hierarchy. However, even more surprising evidence is kept by numismatics, the science of coins. Money has always been a symbol of state power, and the images on it were approved with particular care. If we trace the evolution of coinage in the United States of America, a striking chronology of changes in human appearance is revealed. For 2 centuries, starting from the first issues at the end of the 18th century up to 1909, the profiles depicted on cents and dollars invariably demonstrated that same antique trait. Coins from 1793, 1797, 1809, and even 1908 bear images of faces with perfectly straight noses, forming a single line with the forehead. This was an approved state standard, apparently reflecting the standard of appearance accepted in the highest circles of that time. But then an inexplicable break occurs. The year 1909 becomes a point of no return. Suddenly, without visible reasons, the style changes radically.
On coins issued after this date in 1916, 1921, and later, the profiles acquire modern, familiar traits. A distinct indentation appears at the bridge of the nose, that very angle between the forehead and nose, which is characteristic of an ordinary person. The character on the coins formally remains the same, a symbol of liberty or a historical figure, but their anthropology is completely rewritten. Why did the artists at the Mint, who had followed one tradition for centuries, suddenly forget how to draw straight noses? Or did the change occur not in art, but in reality itself? This sharp transition suggests that it was at the beginning of the 20th century, not only political, but also biological. The old people, or rather the old elite, with their characteristic straight profiles, began to disappear from the visual field, giving way to the modern face type, even.
But the main thing is the profile. The Queen of France possessed that same reference standard straight nose, flowing smoothly into the forehead, which we saw on ancient cameos. And this is not surprising, for she was flesh and blood of the Habsburg dynasty, a family that cultivated its exclusivity for centuries. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, and all her numerous relatives, brothers Joseph II and Leopold III, demonstrate the same architectural facial features. These are high foreheads and massive straight noses without a hint of a bridge, giving their appearance something not quite human when compared to the faces of their own subjects. This family stamp was not a local feature of the Austrian court. A genetic network like a spiderweb covered all of Western Europe. Look at the Stuart dynasty or the Danish kings. Anne of Denmark, wife of King James I, appears in ceremonial portraits with an ideal, almost unnaturally straight profile. Her mother, Sophie of Mecklenburg-Güstrow, and her grandmother from the House of Pomerania possessed the same features. It was a closed circle. The Spanish Bourbons, specifically King Charles III, also bear this indelible imprint, a characteristic nose that is impossible to confuse with anything else. One gets the impression that all these monarchs, kings of Spain, England, Austria, Denmark, were not just relatives, but representatives of a single clan, biologically distinct from the rest of Europe's population. They intermarried only within their circle, not merely for political reasons, but perhaps to preserve the purity of this specific genotype. Thus, until the 19th century, Europe was ruled by one big family whose physical characteristics, a straight Greek nose and a special skull shape, served as a pass to the throne. It was a caste of untouchables whose appearance served as proof of their right to power. But the most surprising thing is that this genetic expansion did not stop at the borders of the Catholic and Protestant worlds. Traces of this mysterious race of rulers lead further east, penetrating behind the Iron Curtain of history, straight into the heart of the Russian Empire. Official historiography insists on a unique national path for Russian czars, but impartial portraits testify that the Russian throne was also occupied by people whose profiles suspiciously resembled their Western cousins, casting doubt on everything we knew about the origin of the Romanov dynasty. It would be naive to believe that the Russian Empire, being an integral part of the world's political arena, remained on the sidelines of this global genetic network. If we cast aside patriotic myths and look at the Romanov dynasty through the prism of anthropology, a picture emerges that is completely identical to what we observed in Western palaces. The Russian throne was occupied by people with the same specific facial features as the rulers of Spain or Austria, which cast serious doubt on the version of their exclusively local origin. Let's begin the analysis with one of the most iconic figures, Peter the Great. His reformist activities and gravitation towards Europe are known to everyone, but few pay attention to his physiognomy as captured by contemporary masters. The face of Russia's first emperor possesses that same characteristic geometry, a powerful straight nose forming a single line with the forehead. This feature can be traced in portraits from his youth and in images from his mature years. His father, Alexei Mykolovich, also possessed an impeccably straight profile, But even more interesting conclusions can be drawn by studying the female line. Peter's mother, Natalia Kirillovna Narishkina, bore a traditional Russian name, but her appearance is the standard of European aristocracy of that time. Her profile is indistinguishable from the profiles of Austrian archduchesses or French princesses, as if she were cast from the same mold. Taking us even deeper into history is the image of Eudoxia Lucian Streshneva, the wife of the first Tsar of the Romanov dynasty, Michael Romanov. Official history says she was chosen as a result of a bride show in 1626, meaning, in essence, she was a random girl from the nobility who won a beauty contest. However, her facial features speak to the contrary. In surviving images, we see a woman with a perfectly regal nose and a high skull, who is indistinguishable from the daughters of the King of Spain or the Queen of Austria. The probability that a random Russian noblewoman accidentally coincided in phenotype with a narrow group of the world elite tends towards 0. This suggests that either her origin was different or the ruling class of Russia initially belonged to the same biological species as the rulers of the rest of Eurasia. This line of blood purity can be traced further. Look at Peter III, the grandson of Peter the Great. Despite his complex reputation, his profile remains canonical, straight, without a dip, exactly like his European contemporaries of the mid-18th century. Anna Petrovna, daughter of Peter I, passed this gene on. It seemed this breed of people would rule forever. But the 19th century arrives and the mechanism breaks. If we trace the evolution of the faces of Russian emperors towards the end of the dynasty, we see a gradual but relentless disappearance of the divine trait. In Paul I, the profile is no longer so ideal, although the general outlines remain. Alexander II and Alexander III increasingly approach the appearance of an ordinary person. And finally, Nicholas II, the last Russians, has practically nothing in common with his distant ancestors in terms of skull structure. He develops a distinct nose bridge, a pit between the forehead and nose, characteristic of modern Homo sapiens. The royal nose disappeared. This process of degradation or dilution of traits occurs synchronously all over the world. It is precisely in the 19th century, at the turn of the 20th, that we observe how a whole species of rulers literally dissolves. They disappear from paintings, they stop being minted on coins, and they are replaced by people with ordinary anatomy. The genetic line that held power for millennia was interrupted, or went into the shadows. But what was the reason for this disappearance? Why did the nosed minority, which for so long and confidently controlled civilization, suddenly give up its place on the forefront of history? And most importantly, did they really disappear without a trace, or did they simply change tactics? Summing up this massive historical investigation, we are faced with a fact that is impossible to ignore. For millennia, from the dawn of the first great civilizations of Egypt and Sumer, right up to the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, humanity was ruled by a narrow, biologically distinct group of beings. This nosed minority, as we have tentatively called it, knew no borders. They occupied thrones in Europe, Asia, and Africa, passing power and specific genetic markers to their descendants. Their distinguishing feature, a straight profile devoid of a bridge and often an elongated skull shape, was not just an aesthetic whim, but a kind of mark of quality, a seal of the right to own the world. However, the 20th century, a century of world wars and the fall of empires, became a turning point when the traces of this ancient caste began to rapidly fade. Officially, the era of kings and emperors ended or transformed into decorative constitutional monarchies, where rulers no longer make real decisions. But does this mean that the biological species that held the reins of government for thousands of years just up and vanished? The logic of power suggests that elites do not dissolve into thin air, they transform. If we shift our gaze from empty thrones to the boards of directors of transnational corporations and banking conglomerates, we see an interesting picture. Consider, for example, the patriarchs of modern financial dynasties, such as the Rothschilds or Rockefellers. In the facial features of some representatives of these families, especially the older generation, one can glimpse echoes of old blood familiar to us from ancient statues. Of course, time and mixing with ordinary people have done their job. The perfectly pure Greek god type with an absolutely straight forehead-nose line is extremely rare today. However, even in a diluted form, this genetics makes itself felt. A specific facial architecture, a heavy gaze, a particular way of holding the head. In figures like David Rockefeller or Jacob Rothschild, one could notice certain anthropological features that distinguish them from the crowd, reminding us of ancient roots. This allows us to assume that the masters of history have not gone anywhere. They simply changed tactics. Instead of openly demonstrating their otherness on gold coins and marble pedestals, they chose to go into the shadows, becoming less noticeable to the general public. Here we approach the main, perhaps most frightening question of our entire investigation.